At a previous conference, I guess 2 years ago, there was after all the sessions, there was a period where we were having recreation and dancing, and Natasha loves to dance, and I had a friend who's rather a skilled dancer, and so I let him dance with her for a while, and then it was my turn, and after that, Aubrey said to me, "Max, you're a terrible dancer." However, one thing, Aubrey, that I'm good at is defining things, especially transhumanism. So I have to take issue with your interpretation of my definition, which, by the way, I've replaced since then. It's really got nothing to do with making us less human. It's actually got to do with preserving the best qualities that we see as humanity. It's really building on the Enlightenment ideals that we have to use reason and science and goodwill and so on to improve humanity perpetually. It's not about being less human or dropping humanity, except in the sense if you get rid of aging, is that losing something or is it actually gaining something? So I'd rather see transhumanism, which it's probably useful to have a definition here at the beginning. Transhumanism is really part of the Enlightenment project of continually improving the human species, or allowing us as individuals to improve ourselves, is the way I prefer to put it, and so I'm not talking about any kind of compulsion on the species. It's really about allowing ourselves to extend our lifespans, to remove that limit. It's about removing other limits. It's about removing cognitive limits. Can we get smarter? And not just a little bit smarter, but much smarter, much more intelligent, much wiser, much less prone to fallacies in our thinking and all the biases that are inherent in our biology. It's about improving our emotions, refining our emotions. Again, we've inherited a lot of rather unpleasant characteristics in our emotions. Perhaps we can improve those beyond anything we've been able to do so far, using both technology and other means. It's also about morphological freedom, a term I coined to refer to a whole group of changes in our body. We already see people now having sex changes, for instance, which would have seemed very radical not so long ago. That's just a very minor part of this. It's really about, can we choose who we are? Can we choose ourselves physically, cognitively, emotionally, and so on? And can we choose our lifespan? Can we choose where we live, not only on this planet, but perhaps move beyond the planet? It encompasses all those ideas. And that's why in my own particular version of transhumanism, I coined the term, or actually my friend of mine coined the term extropy, which means essentially moving beyond limits in all these ways, fundamentally challenging those supposedly essential limits of human nature. And that's really what I'm talking about today, is what I think underlies a lot of the objections to transhumanism, or a lot of the worries or concerns, is some notion of limits, some special limits that we shouldn't question. I think you can see that in many different forms. In the title of my talk, I use the term hyperagency, which I think I like it because it sounds like a superpower if you have hyperagency. But this is a term that was used by the philosopher Michael Sandel, well known for his political philosophy. He wrote an article in The Atlantic in which he based a pretty well-put case, one of the better cases against transhumanism, on this idea of hyperagency. It's referred to, as he put it, the Promethean desire to remake human nature to preserve and satisfy our desires. I think the first part of that is better than the second part. It's not about it's not about preserving our desires. In fact, it's about questioning our desires and improving them, perhaps. But certainly it is Promethean drive or urge to continually improve ourselves to remake human nature. And doing that, of course, means if human nature has any kind of meaning at all, and I think it does, that has to imply certain limits. So it's only in that sense that we are transhumanists, because we're talking about perhaps moving beyond those limits that define being human. I would argue, for instance, that you have to have some kind of genetic component to the idea of humanity. That's what distinguishes us from other species. If we were to change ourselves biologically and genetically sufficiently, or to perhaps make our genes rather irrelevant by adding extra chromosomes, synthetic chromosomes, or by having a different kind of technological operating system, we really wouldn't be human in that strict sense. That's why I think transhumanism does make sense, even though it doesn't mean losing anything or becoming less than human. So I think this idea of hyperagency is quite handy in the sense that it does encompass a lot of the objections that have been put forth based on the idea of limitations and the idea that we should respect those limitations among the critics. You see versions of this, for instance, among people like Leon Kass, who used to be the head of the President's Council on Bioethics and quite an intelligent critic. And you see it in other people like Francis Fukuyama in his book, where he gave a critique based on the idea of a fixed human nature, which we really shouldn't change, otherwise we're going to end up with various kinds of problems. I think you can see another good example of this, another fairly well-known writer, Bill McKibben. In fact, his book, the title itself, points to this very idea of limits of the issue. His book is simply titled, Enough. He's looking at all these changes we want to make, all these limit-busting ideas, and he's saying, enough, let's stop this, let's just stay fixed, stay who we are, essentially, don't try to make any radical changes. So I really think that most critiques of transhumanism, most worries and concerns are based around this idea of overcoming limits and worries about that. Sandel goes into some detail as to what that means. For instance, he clearly from some kind of religious perspective, I'm not sure exactly what that religion is, but he talks about the idea of respecting the given nature of human beings, the giftedness of human nature. Now, clearly, to believe that we're gifted, that you have to believe there is a giver. And he's trying to stress that distinction and saying there are problems that come from not respecting the giftedness in his view. He distinguishes between beholding and molding. He believes we should behold ourselves, we should behold the world as it is, and not do so much of the molding. And of course, transhumanism is all about molding. Although that sounds like a little bit of a controlling way of putting it. I think there are better concepts than that. Self-transformation doesn't have to be molding in any kind of too-directed sense. But it is about shaping. It's about taking choice, taking things out of nature's randomness, as I would argue, and instead making more conscious decisions about where we want to go. Among people like Francis Fukuyama especially, and also I think Leon Kass, is this idea, again, that we have a fixed human nature and there's something special about that, having that human nature, that if we challenge that, we will lose solidarity with our species, or we will gain too much responsibility. I think that's a worry that Kass has. He says, let's see if I can find his quote, he says that his real worry is not the erosion of responsibility, it's the explosion of responsibility, by which, of course, he means that if we have the choice now, not just over, do I wear a jacket today, but choice about what skin color should I have today, or how many heads should I have today, or should I have multiple bodies today? If those are actual possibilities, not just in online worlds, but actually in physical reality, then we have a huge number of choices. If we can decide, should I fundamentally rethink my cognitive architecture so that I respond differently, I think differently, or to rewire how I feel emotionally. Not just, we're already doing this obviously with psychoactive drugs, antidepressant drugs, anti-anxiety drugs, all these performance enhancers that people take. These are already an early stage of this that raise some of these issues, but not on the fundamental level yet that the transhumanists like to talk about. So this kind of concern about respecting limits and transhumanist desire to transcend limits, to push past them, often the word that comes up again, especially I think among people like Kass, is the idea of hubris. So transhumanists, another way of defining them, kind of a bit of a silly definition, but not entirely wrong, is that transhumanists are those who think that hubris is not bad. There's nothing wrong with hubris. Now, of course, it depends on how you define the term. You can define it so it is inherently bad. But if it essentially means a kind of a Nietzschean urging to overcome yourself, to continually improve, then transhumanists do champion that very much. They don't think there's anything about the given world that should necessarily be a final objection to improving ourselves. And it's not that all transhumanists are unreligious. I would agree that most are. Most are very skeptical about religion in general, but there are religious transhumanists of all kinds of different religions, Christians and Mormons and Islamic transhumanists. But I think what is common to them is the idea that if there is a God, a creator of some kind, then we have no particular reason to believe that that God, that supreme being, would tell us, I made you as you are and you must stay that way forever. Now, okay, a fundamentalist may believe that, but anybody with a more liberal religious view surely has to accept some version of the idea that a supreme being, if there is one, put us here to make something of ourselves, either to demonstrate our worth, to demonstrate that we're worthy of love, or to be redeemed. Whatever the version is, it does improve some kind of self-improvement. Now, why should that stop at what we're used to, the usual human lifespan, the usual level of intelligence that we have, the usual level of compassion, the usual ability to care about people who are not part of our tribe? Why should that be a fundamental limit? You could go back in history and look at a time when almost every civilization had slaves, for instance. And of course, you can look at the slavery literature, even in America, from not so long ago, and the idea was that slavery was perfectly natural. We all exploit one another. We exploit other tribes and different types of people. And to question that would be considered irreligious and clearly against the given limits that we're supposed to respect. So my question is, I do understand this idea that limits are important because it is scary. It's frightening to be thrown into the wilderness or into the stars of space, as Nietzsche talked about it, to have this vertigo. Where do I go? What do I do? What choices can I make if there are no limits anymore? Now, of course, it's not really that drastic. It's not going to be one day there are suddenly no limits. As Aubrey was saying, it's a progression, a gradual progression. But it is frightening. It is worrying if what you have is your traditional view looking backwards, a historical view, and you don't really see the possible scenarios of the future and how that could come about. It seems to involve too many choices. So again, the worry here is that there's an increased burden on us by having more choices and more responsibility. And that, of course, is true. But the idea of transhumanism is we also increase our capacity at the same time. Yes, we have more choices, but we increase our capacity. It always makes me think of this anecdote I heard from someone. This is back in the good old days when the Soviet Union was still standing. Somebody who managed to get a pass out of the country and come to the United States, which wasn't that easy to do back then, and went into a drugstore to buy some toothpaste. And they saw row upon row of different toothpaste, different flavors, different colors, different makes. And they went out without being able to buy any and just shaking their head. How could anybody make these choices? But you and I will probably find that rather amusing now because it's not a big deal. We managed to do that. And there are some complex consumer choices, but we have learned to handle those, and we have different mechanisms that evolve to help us look at ratings and so on, get recommendations, and we can handle that. So I think when we look into the future and we see all these possibilities and we worry about what would I do with 5,000 years of life, first of all, remember, you don't have to make that choice now all at once. You can think about what would I do with another 10 years, and after that, maybe you'll figure out the next 10 or 20 years. Things will change too, so it would be unreasonable to actually plan out 5,000 years ahead. As most of you will realize, if you think about it, planning out the next day ahead is probably kind of dubious. It's not going to actually end up being quite the way you expect. So you don't have to make all these choices now. I think what transhumanism is saying is that it's good that we can continue this progress, this evolution, this development, a self-guided development, yes, with a degree of caution and humility. So in this sense, it shouldn't be inconsistent with hubris, because we can make mistakes, we can screw things up, so we do have to be careful. I think that is a call for combining both critical thinking and creative thinking. Creative thinking to imagine scenarios of possible futures, to see how the world could be better, to really challenge hard our presuppositions about the way things must be, because we do tend to cling to those. And also the critical thinking, very importantly, to question how could technologies go wrong, how could various applications of technologies go wrong, how can we actually have trials of these things that make them safer or reduce the magnitude of any possible problems, because there will be problems. Transhumanists are not utopians, they don't believe everything will be perfect, there'll be no mistakes. The idea is that we need to improve our capacity to learn from our mistakes as we go along.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. I think there are some positive things we can do. If I'm right that I think fundamental qualities of transhumanism are essentially to break beyond limits, to question fundamental limits that we've always accepted. And if I'm right that a lot of the objections and discomfort with transhumanism comes precisely from that drive to overcome limits, what could we do about that? Well, I think there are a number of things we can do. We have to, first of all, spend some serious time actually imagining possible futures and what they will be like and what kind of choices we might have and how would we make those choices. If, for instance, we're so used to having a human identity or even an identity as a particular kind of human, I mean, if you take me, go back 25 years or so, I was a human being, a white male from South England who went to a certain college and so on, had a certain background. But that wasn't really me, that was just my situation at the time. And I could have, and I did actually imagine possible futures. I imagined myself in California for one thing, and I made that happen, which was a big improvement when I was stuck in a rather, at that time, poverty-ridden country and facing the prospect of being a poor graduate student. To come to Southern California, that was a very nice idea, and I did imagine that, and it did happen, and rather than being shocked by it, as can happen when you suddenly move 6,000 miles, I delighted in it. It was a great pleasure. So it does help to actually think ahead and imagine those futures and see which ones might suit you. There's a paper by a law professor at USC who I know quite well, Michael Sandel. There's an article titled "Fragmenting and Reassembling the World of Flying Squirrels, Augmented Persons and Other Monsters." And he talks about this challenge of fragmenting our identity, that we're used to being a human being or a male or a female or a particular religion or political view or having a certain community and identifying with that. One of the big challenges is to, as he says, to fragment that identity and to reassemble it into perhaps better forms, more desirable forms. And that has to be based on a certain amount of vision. You have to spend some time with personal visioning. If I say that in certain transhumanist circles, they might accuse me of being a new ager to talk about personal visioning, but I think that's a very important thing, to imagine possible futures and then to create those. I think metaphors and stories are a very important part of that. A lot of science fiction is really badly written and not very imaginative, but there are some good stories there which might help us to imagine at least aspects of what it would be like to be post-human, certainly in the more recent science fiction. I'm not talking about movie science fiction, which is almost universally dreadful in that respect. I'm talking about written science fiction. So stories and perhaps new myths may help us to reimagine those possibilities and not be so frightened of doing away with old limits that we're used to. And again, I think one important realization is that, again, we don't have to make all these choices at once. We don't have to choose everything about our future self right now. Just to be open. In fact, ironically, we can go back to Michael Sandel, who says that we should be open to the unbidden. I think as transhumanists, with the transhumanist perspective, we should be open to the unbidden, realizing that we can create ourselves, but where that will lead us exactly, we don't know. We have to be open to making new choices as we go along. So I think through visioning, adopting certain core principles which help us to retain a core of personality through great change, which actually was a subject of my doctoral dissertation. How do you do that? How do you stay the same person all the time through great change? I think having a set of core principles does help you do that, combine massive change with some stability. And there could also be certain technologies that can help us do that by perhaps integrating our cognition and our emotion better. There are studies in neuroscience that show that those systems are not well integrated, except in the direction that our emotions can spur us to have certain thoughts, but we're not very good at modulating our emotions directly by thinking. Better connections implanted by technology may help us do that. So overall, the goal, my essential message is that if you've thought about transhumanism and have looked at the Global Spiral articles, 2 special issues you should go look at if you haven't, and if you find your concerns seem to revolve around the idea of removing limits at this fundamental level is very worrying or disturbing, I think you have to think very carefully about why that is. Why is that so uncomfortable? And are there actually some rather stirring possibilities, positive possibilities to consider that also arise from that? Thank you.